The emperor, aware of this popularity, hesitated to secure a separation. It was in order to overcome his indecision that all sorts of schemes were set in operation. A great fuss was made about the empress's enormous debts. It was her kindness of heart that made her incur them, and it was the poor who benefited by them. The knowledge of the extent of her generosity and the difficulties in which it involved her increased the public's affection for the empress. Only the emperor, passionately fond of order, was pitiless in his condemnation of her conduct in this respect. In the end of the year was always the most painful moment for my mother, crushed beneath the weight of debts that fell due then. Debts which she had allowed to accumulate through fear of confessing to her husband the extent of her extravagance. Having raged about them, the emperor settled the debts, but the police found ways to revive his wrath by indicating that the empress had only admitted half of the total of what she owed. Thus, by sowing the seeds of dissension, they hoped to bring about a separation. I was still living at St. Cloud when the emperor left for Erfurt, where all the reigning princes of Germany, as well as the emperor of Russia, were to meet him. I witnessed the tears my mother shed when she thought about this journey. The emperor reassured her, saying this gathering was purely political and had nothing to do with those family alliances which were being talked about. As a matter of fact, the intimacy which existed at the time between the Emperor Napoleon and the Emperor of Russia led people to suppose that a marriage between Napoleon and the Grand Duchess Catherine of Russia might take place. The result of the meeting at Erfurt was still further to increase the intimacy between the two monarchs. This was shown by all sorts of incidents. For example, in a tragedy given by French actors which they attended at the line, "A great man's friendship is a gift of the gods." Emperor Alexander leaned over and threw his arm around Emperor Napoleon, embracing him. The Princess of Baden was extremely popular at Erfurt. The Emperor of Russia was most attentive to her. Duroc, who told me about it, also spoke of Alexander's passion for another woman, which had lasted 15 years. He added, "He is the only man who might turn your Majesty's head. For your own peace of mind, I hope you will never see him. In spite of the attention he showed your cousin, I am sure if he met you, he would be unfaithful to everything else he cared about." "You are flattering me," I replied. "I do not believe that I know how to charm people." "You do more than charm them," he continued. "You arouse their sympathy. And knowing the Emperor Alexander as I do, I am convinced that your character and your intellect would please him greatly. I must admit, he has all the gallantry of a French knight. We no longer have that refinement of feeling and sentiment which he possesses and which is necessary to please you." "Then I must take care to never see him," I exclaimed laughingly. "Judging by what you say, we are so absolutely made for one another that we could not escape our mutual attraction. Although I am no great believer in the theory of love at first sight, I consider it very fortunate that I did not happen to be at Erfurt. There, at any rate, fate kept us apart. I was completely ignorant of what was going on in the political world, and the emperor preferred not to inform me of such matters, even when our own most vital interests were involved. I only learned that my eldest son had been made Grand Duke of Berg when the Master of Ceremonies wrote my chief lady in waiting, asking when I could receive the visit of congratulation from the Senate. I sent my son to thank the emperor, and I received the congratulations regarding this event without feeling the least pleased about it. I can only explain this indifference on the ground that our rank was already so exalted that a duchy more or less did not make much difference. On the contrary, I feared that the additional pomp connected with this new title might give my son false ideas regarding his importance in the world, for I specially desired him to have merits of his own, and constantly belittled all those gifts which his birth conferred on him, trying to persuade him that only what he accomplished by himself had any real value. Personally, I frequently felt depressed at the thought of all these crowns held by our family and the idea that my sons were the sole heirs of all this power. I fancied that in time They would be separated from me forever, one ruling in the north, one in the south, and all the pomp and circumstance of royalty seemed to me to hold no promise of happiness either for me or the rest of my family. I was never one of those to whom the wearing of a crown meant happiness. Thus, our imagination frequently evokes misfortunes which never take place, while at the same time it does not foresee the other evils that fate holds in store for us. After the council at Erfurt, the various generals set out for Spain. Caroline went to Naples. My mother and I took the emperor to Rambouillet, whence he left to join the army in Spain. The empress was even sadder than usual on this occasion when she said goodbye to her husband. "Will you never stop making war?" she asked him. And I remember how the emperor answered, "Do you mean to say you think I enjoy doing it? Don't you think I would rather stay where I have a good bed and a good dinner instead of facing all the hardship I have before me? Don't you think I am the same as other men? You're wrong. I know how to do other things besides wage a war, but necessity and my duty toward France force me to do so. It is not I who command the course of events. I only obey." This war began under such unfavorable auspices that everyone was vaguely worried about the outcome. The officers did not undertake it with that martial eagerness which I noticed on other occasions. They only obeyed orders. No one can witness the departure of the persons she cares about without feeling apprehensive. Perhaps this was particularly true in my own case. For being ill, I was inclined to exaggerate all possible harm that the future might bring. It was the fashion just then to collect carved Turkish jewels, and I had a large number of them. I imagined that an amulet given by me might act as a talisman. At least I made myself think this, in order to give away a great many little gifts, so as to have an excuse for sending one to a particular person. Moreover, I said to myself, why should not my lot have certain compensations? If I am unhappy, perhaps at least I can bring good luck to others. In that case, I should not complain of my own fate. I gave all the emperor's aides de camp these little amulets, recommending them to wear the object constantly if they wish to be safe from all danger. When one's sentimental interests are at stake, it is astonishing how the smallest things become important. For instance, a number of my young ladies who were very much in love with their husbands, among them Madame Philippe de Ségur, came and asked me very seriously for one of my Turkish talismans. As it happened, almost all those who were my amulets escaped every danger. Monsieur de Bongar, for instance, who was thought to be dead, found refuge in a convent. While he was still missing, and when everyone was worried about his fate, I always declared he would come back safely because he had one of my tokens. General Colbert lost his during an engagement. He wrote asking me to send another. I was about to do so when word reached me that this really distinguished man had been killed. The news was a shock to me, and without intending to, I exclaimed, "Why did he lose my amulet?" I realized then that I had come to attach a superstitious importance to something that at first had been merely an idle whim. After that, I always sent a talisman to my brother at the beginning of each new campaign, and I should have been worried if he had neglected to wear it constantly. Everywhere, my uneasiness sought for some form of remedy, and I came to consider important things that my reason knew were futile. The emperor, before he left, had expressed his hope that I would return to Holland. After all I had endured, I considered it cruel on his part to oblige me to go back to a man who had made me so miserable. Have I no family of my own? I said to myself. I seem to live here on sufferance only, whereas they ought to be glad to see me living away from my husband on account of my reputation, to say nothing of my health. I am not guilty of any of the faults of which I am accused. People know it, and yet do not take my part. Instead of any longer hiding so jealously the way in which my husband has persecuted me, as I have done up to now, had I not better reveal my sufferings and make my misfortunes known to everyone? Should I not accuse him openly and demand just compensation for all the pain he has caused me? I took all the blame on myself. Therefore, it is I who have to pay the penalty for having done right. Now, when I complain, I'm treated like a child who protests against his master's treatment. Thus, my distress made me unfair, for I should have remembered that after all I was only the emperor's stepdaughter, whereas my husband was his own brother. He could not defend me without attacking Louis, and he was already doing a great deal for me in allowing me to remain so long in Paris when I should really have been in Holland. Doubtless it was on account of my children that the emperor allowed me to remain so long in France, in spite of all the efforts of my husband's family to make me leave sooner. One day, I received the visit of Grand Marshal de Broc, who, like the other Frenchmen, did not find his stay at the Dutch court any more agreeable on account of the additional titles he received there. He had, as a matter of fact, been commanded by a royal decree to give up his French citizenship. He refused to do so, and enlisted as a volunteer in order to serve during the Spanish campaign under the orders of his brother-in-law, the Duke of Elchingen. Nay, he brought me news of something I already suspected. My husband's Minister of Justice was Monsieur van Manen. The king sent for him and gave orders to have everything possible done to discredit me in the eyes of the public. These were the instructions of Monsieur van Manen. Received. Spread reports that the Queen dislikes Holland intensely, that she's enjoying herself in France, and that her conduct there is not at all respectable. The minister drew back in astonishment and said, "But sire, she's your wife and Queen of Holland. I cannot do such a thing as that." "You are right," replied the king, suddenly embarrassed. "I was merely testing your loyalty." The next day, the minister was dismissed. He told the reason for his dismissal from office to everyone, and among others to Monsieur de Broc, who repeated it to me. How was I to believe that passion could so far blind an upright man as to induce him to act in such a way toward the mother of his children? I tried to doubt these stories. I preferred to believe that the minister was making a false report rather than think that my husband was behaving in so abject a manner. I attempted to excuse the mad actions his jealousy made him commit by reminding myself of that kindness of heart which I had several times had occasion to notice in him. But the mere thought of reconciliation was enough to make my heart sink within me. All the misery he had inflicted on me reappeared before my eyes. Overcome with fear, the only explanation I could find for his conduct was the hatred I imagined he felt toward me, and I realized the necessity of avoiding placing myself within his grasp. Since the emperor's departure, my mother was living at the palace of the Élysée. It had been decreed that Frenchmen who received foreign crowns were not entitled to any further income from French sources. Consequently, I had no allowance with which to pay the expenses of my household, and in order not to be obliged to ask anyone for money, I dismissed all my servants. I planned to live at the Élysée with my mother. This decrease in my wealth was the least of my worries. The emperor heard what I had done and scolded me severely. He fixed my income at 700,000 francs. As the war interfered with the prosperity of the Paris luxury trade, the latter had decreased, and many workmen suffered from this depression of business. The emperor, who knew how to attend to minor matters as well as to conceive and execute great enterprises, had 6,000 francs given me per month in order that I might help the unemployed. Cardinal Fesch, Madame Mère, and Princess Pauline received the same sum, which, together with what they gave personally, amounted to quite an important amount. As for me, I gave as much as I could to relieve the suffering of the poor. I admit the fact quite simply. There is no merit in this if one has a large fortune and a high rank. In such cases, it is not necessary, in order to assure one's popularity, to announce the fact in the newspaper. None of us considered what we deserved the slightest credit for acting as we did, and the emperor would have been angry had we thought so. While the emperor was busy with the war in Spain, Austria began to give him grounds for uneasiness and forced him to hurry back. Without having concluded the other war, which was growing more serious, Monsieur de Talleyrand, who, even after he had given up his post as Minister of Foreign Affairs, continued to concern himself with what went on in Spain, had, so it was rumored, advised the policy that the emperor followed at first. As soon as he realized that things were not going well, he began to make fun of a campaign which was not as successful as the others had been. One day, Madame Remusat called on me. She told me how much the reputation of M. Talleyrand had suffered as far as the emperor was concerned, through people's repeating remarks he had never made and saying he had certain opinions which were not at all those he really held. She wept freely when she informed me how seriously Monsieur de Talleyrand felt his disgrace and declared she had not the slightest idea who could have sought to harm a man like Monsieur de Talleyrand, who was absolutely devoted to the Emperor's interests. She begged me to grant him an interview and to try to have the Emperor make peace with him. I remembered his attentions had flattered me while we were at my aunt's. Since then I had met Monsieur de Talleyrand again, and he had not seemed to be aware of my presence. It was true, I'd lost my son, and Talleyrand belonged to that class of people who disappear in the presence of misfortune. Nevertheless, as one of the high dignitaries of the court, he had called on me when my latest child had been born, and in his carelessly polite manner had said, "It depends solely upon your majesty how many princes we are to have. Our future happiness is entirely in your hands." Since then, I had never even heard him spoken of, and I confess I was delighted to have the opportunity of revenging myself for this apparent neglect by doing him a kindness. Monsieur de Talleyrand arrived a few moments after Madame de Remusat had taken her departure. His attitude conveyed the hope that I would take his part, but he scarcely mentioned what he would like to have me do for him. He was no more cordial in his manner than usual, and I seemed the one who was asking a favor. The tears of Madame de Remusat and her eagerness to defend her friend's interests contrasted strongly with the indifferent air of that haughty personage. I promised to speak to the Emperor about him that same evening, and I am under the impression that Talleyrand obtained my promise without having asked me for it. Madame de Staël knew him well. Her portrait of him in the novel called Delphine, under the name of Madame de Vernon, is a striking one, and I have on several occasions noted how closely it resembles the original. In accordance with my promise, I went that same evening to the Tuileries and assumed a chagrined manner in announcing to the Emperor that I had seen a person who was deeply grieved at being in disgrace. I spoke of that person's devotion to the Emperor and depicted his grief vividly. In fact, I lied so outrageously that I do not know how I managed to keep from smiling. When at length I mentioned the name of Monsieur de Talleyrand, the Emperor burst out laughing. "Oh, it's Talleyrand you've been talking about, is it?" he exclaimed. "Do you mean to say he called on you this morning?" "Yes, sire," and he seemed greatly distressed. "But does he think I don't know all the remarks he has been making? He has been trying to make himself popular at my expense. I won't interfere with him anymore. Let him keep talking if he wants to. But, sire, how can one repeat the marks of a man who never says two words in succession? To make such statements is pure libel. My daughter, you do not know society. My information is accurate. Though he may not talk against me in front of you, he makes up for it at 2 o'clock in the morning when he is with Madame de Laval and the rest of them. As a matter of fact, I am not taking any steps against him. Only I wish that he would not interfere with my affairs." I do not know whether, in spite of what he said, the Emperor was touched by my description of Monsieur de Talleyrand's grief, or whether other persons intervened. At any rate, a reconciliation seemed to take place between the two men. To be sure, Talleyrand was not again allowed to hold office, a fact which wounded him on account of his ambitious nature, and which he never forgave. Even his post of Lord High Chamberlain was taken from him and given to Monsieur de Montesquieu. This made people say that the Emperor was much too inclined to humiliate his courtiers and not enough inclined to punish them. Madame de Talleyrand, whom I knew only slightly, called on me one morning while her husband was still High Chamberlain. "Knowing how kind you are," she said, "may I venture to ask you to include Monsieur de Talleyrand among the persons whom you invite to play whist with you at the Emperor's reception? He, as Lord High Chamberlain, is the one who arranges your table. He comes and takes your commands as to who are to be invited, and it is disagreeable to him, as one of the principal figures at court, never to be chosen himself by any of the princesses." I promised Madame de Talleyrand to do as she wished. It had simply never occurred to any of us to ask Monsieur de Talleyrand to play with us, as we always believed he was too busy doing the honors. Vague rumors announced the approach of a new war with Austria. What appeared at first sight to be a minor incident caused us to believe these rumors were based on fact. Whenever an important reception took place, there would always be card playing after the theatrical performance or the meeting of the Emperor's ministers. We would go upstairs with the Empress to the Emperor's big study, where our tables were set out. Generally, the emperor did not play himself, and we and the empress gave the high chamberlain the names of the persons he was to invite to play with us. The persons chosen were generally the principal foreign ambassadors or the high court dignitaries. At the time of which I am now speaking, the emperor said to the empress, with an apparently indifferent air, "Who are your partners this evening?" And without waiting for a reply, gave the names of 3 persons. He asked us the same question and also chose our partners. It was easy enough for us to guess that this was done in order to avoid having Monsieur de Metternich, the Austrian ambassador, invited to play with us, although he was generally invited at one of our tables. On this occasion, he was obliged to play with the ladies in waiting.